There is a verse written nearly 2,000 years ago, a few lines tucked inside a letter from a prison cell, that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to fully explain. The Apostle Paul, writing to a church in Philippi around 60 AD, offered what seemed at the time like simple spiritual advice. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds. Philippians 4:6-7. At the time, no one had a word for cortisol. No one had ever seen a brain scan. No one knew what the prefrontal cortex was, or what happened to it under chronic stress. And yet, encoded in those two verses, is a prescription that neuroscientists today are spending millions of dollars and decades of research to rediscover. This is not a coincidence. And this is not a story about blind faith versus cold science. This is a story about how an ancient practice rewires the human brain in ways we can now measure, see, and prove. We live in what researchers are calling the age of anxiety. The American Psychological Association consistently reports that the majority of adults in developed nations experience stress so severe it affects their physical health. And the reason is largely biological. When your brain perceives a threat, whether it's a lion on the savannah or an unanswered email from your boss, a small almond-shaped region deep in your brain called the amygdala fires off an alarm. It signals the hypothalamus to flood your bloodstream with stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart rate spikes, your muscles tighten, your body prepares to fight or flee. This response saved our ancestors' lives. But today, it rarely turns off. And chronic cortisol elevation does something devastating. It literally begins to shrink the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thought, emotional regulation, and decision-making. Prolonged anxiety, in a very measurable physical sense, makes it harder to think clearly and feel at peace. Paul wrote, "Do not be anxious about anything." Science now shows us exactly why anxiety is so destructive. But the more remarkable question is, what did Paul prescribe instead, and does it actually work? Prayer. For centuries, skeptics have dismissed prayer as wishful thinking, talking to no one, a psychological crutch. But in the last 20 years, a growing body of neuroscientific research has forced researchers to take a very different look. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at Thomas Jefferson University, has spent his career scanning the brains of people in the act of prayer and meditation. What his research found was striking. When people engage in focused, intentional prayer, especially prayer involving gratitude and surrender, activity in the prefrontal cortex actually increases. The very region that anxiety erodes begins to light up. Blood flow to the areas responsible for focus, compassion, and self-awareness surges. The brain, during prayer, is not going quiet. It is going to work. But there is a second mechanism at work, one that connects even more directly to those two verses in Philippians. Notice that Paul does not just say pray. He says pray with thanksgiving. This detail, which might have seemed like a polite rhetorical flourish, turns out to be neurochemically precise. Research from the University of California, Davis, conducted by Dr. Robert Emmons, widely considered one of the world's leading scientific experts on gratitude, demonstrated that people who regularly practiced gratitude showed measurably lower cortisol levels. In one study, participants who kept gratitude journals had 23% lower cortisol than control groups. But the most profound finding wasn't hormonal. It was structural. Brain imaging showed that regular expressions of gratitude and thankfulness produced lasting changes in the neural pathways of the medial prefrontal cortex. The brain was not just temporarily calmed, it was being physically reshaped. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself based on repeated experience. Paul told believers to pray with thanksgiving in the 1st century. Neuroscience in the 21st century confirmed that thanksgiving literally restructures the brain toward peace. Consider also what Paul says will result from this practice. Not just a feeling of calm, not simply optimism. He describes something far more precise: the peace of God, which transcends all understanding. The Greek word used here is eirene, a peace that is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of wholeness, completeness, integration. And fascinatingly, this maps onto what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when a person is at rest and internally focused. In people who pray or meditate regularly, the default mode network shows greater coherence and integration. The brain's various systems communicate more efficiently. The person is, in a neurological sense, more whole, more internally unified. The ancient description of a peace that passes all understanding and the modern description of enhanced neural coherence are pointing at the same experience from two different directions. There is also the matter of the body. When the stress response quiets, when cortisol recedes and the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, the effects are not limited to mood. Blood pressure lowers, inflammation decreases, immune function improves. Dr. Harold Koenig of Duke University, who has studied the relationship between religious practice and health for decades, found in a review of over 1,500 studies that regular prayer was associated with lower rates of depression, lower blood pressure, and faster recovery from illness. The body, it turns out, is profoundly affected by what the mind does when it kneels. Paul's promise that this peace would guard, the Greek word is phrorio, a military term meaning to stand sentinel, to keep watch. Their hearts and their minds was not metaphor. The body's own biological systems, when prayer shifts them from alarm to rest, quite literally guard the physical heart and the thinking mind. What is remarkable about Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is not just that the advice is good. It is that the mechanism is described with an accuracy that predates the science by 2 millennia. Be specific in your prayer. Studies show that focused, intentional thought produces stronger neural activation than vague, distracted rumination. Include thanksgiving. Gratitude restructures the brain's stress response systems. Surrender your anxiety rather than suppressing it. Repression, modern psychology confirms, worsens anxiety, while release diminishes it. And then receive the peace that stands guard over your mind. Because the neurological consequence of this practice is a brain that becomes, over time, more resilient, more regulated, more capable of stillness. We have a tendency to think of faith and science as standing on opposite banks of a river, shouting across the water at each other. But sometimes, the river reveals that they have been describing the same shore. A man in chains in a Roman prison wrote 2 sentences about prayer, petition, and thanksgiving, and promised that peace beyond comprehension would follow. Thousands of years later, scientists in laboratories with functional MRI machines and cortisol assays have begun to map exactly why he was right. The ancient wisdom was not waiting to be validated by science, but it is something extraordinary when it is.